The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
One of the concepts in Judaism that has always been in the forefront of my mind is the concept of Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh, the idea that we are all responsible for one another. What does this mean? How far must we take it? Where do our responsibilities start and end? Is it a physical responsibility or a spiritual responsibility? In fact, one can argue that my semi-obsession with this topic may be one of the reasons that this podcast even exists. Luckily for me, I have on the perfect person to help me unpack and understand the topic.
Hi, my name is Aryeh Lebowitz. I am the rabbi of the Beis Haknesses of North Woodmere, and I am the director of the semicha program at Yeshiva University, Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan.
Rabbi Lebowitz has spent his entire life having a tremendous positive effect on others, and I was glad to be able to have him on for this week's show. In fact, within the first few moments of our discussion, he helps me to understand that I've been saying it incorrectly my entire life. All right, Rabbi Lebowitz, thank you so much for joining me this week. I want to get a little bit of a background. I know you mentioned that a little bit of what you do, but I want to get a little bit of a background of how you arrived in specifically the two positions that you're in now in Yeshiva University and in North Woodmere. So just a general background. We don't have to go too deep into your biography. That's for a different book or a different podcast. But for now, I just want to get just a general sense of where you started from and and how you got here.
Okay. As far as North Woodmere, I was working as a rabbinic intern and then an assistant rabbi in a shul in Lawrence, New York, in Shari Tefillah. And a few people who had just recently moved into North Woodmere, which was not yet heavily populated with from people, reached out to me to start a shul together. And we did. And that was 17 years ago. And here we are. As far as YU and RIETS, that was a bit of a more, a longer route. And it really also came out of nowhere. Most of my adult life, I've been teaching in high school. That's how I know your brother-in-law. And he was a student of mine in high school and a wonderful guy. And at some point, people reached out to me to try to make the move and deal with older students. And we did. About 3 years ago, I started in Yeshiva University.
Phenomenal. And the reason that I invited you on the show this week is to discuss a topic that is both near and dear to my heart personally, and also one of the driving forces behind why this podcast existed. On previous shows, I explained some of the reasons why I have this show. One of the reasons that I don't think I've touched on is my fascination with the topic of Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh. So what we deal with on these shows is more of a practical guide to being a frum Jew. There are shows out there, and they're phenomenal, that deal with concepts and talking about the theoretical. I like to focus more on the show on the practical, on the day-to-day life, on the week-to-week life of a frum Jew. And the concept of Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh is kind of that driving force behind it. Now, the reason that I invited you specifically on for this topic of discussion is because I was looking for someone who has a profound impact on people, but does not necessarily have a prior relationship with me. I was looking for somebody like that. And I know that you have continued, based on your credentials and what we were talking about. Plus, as you mentioned, my brother-in-law was a Talmud of yours in high school, and he was able to connect us together. And I know the impact that you can have on people's lives. So I was very excited to have you come on and discuss this topic. But before we get into any of it, what I would like to do is if you can give me a basic definition of, when you hear the concept of Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh, what does that actually mean?
It's interesting because there are actually two definitions of Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh. There's the way it's used colloquially, which is what I imagine you're referring to, and there's the way it's used halachically, meaning this concept of Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh Bazeh comes up all over Chazal. It's a Gemara in Sanhedrin and Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah. It's everywhere. It's all over Chazal. And halachically, what it means is quite simply that if I've already been yotzei a mitzvah, I can be motzi other people in a mitzvah, in that mitzvah. Normally, that defies the normal rule. Normally, if I'm not obligated in something, I can't be motzi somebody else in that mitzvah because I don't have my own obligation. So on a halachic level, Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh Bazeh says that if I am obligated, but then I did the mitzvah, so therefore I'm no longer obligated, the fact that you haven't done the mitzvah yet means that it's as if I still have an obligation, and therefore I can be motzi you in that mitzvah. And now that ties into the colloquial way it's used.
So before you get into that, so just on a practical level, because that's what this show's all about, things like Kiddush on Shabbos afternoon, you go to a Kiddush and then you come home and then you make Kiddush for other people, or Megillah Esther, if you laid the Megillah already, you can come and lane it again for someone else.
Right, and shofar, and right.
And, yeah, all of the mitzvahs that basically require brachos.
Right, and any mitzvah that involves being motzi someone else, which is usually shomea ka'oneh, usually involves a mitzvah of speech so that somebody else can hear it, and it's as if they're saying it, but they have to hear it from a bar chiyuva, from someone who's obligated.
Right.
And the chiddush of this idea is that it's still considered that I'm obligated in it, even though I'm not, because I already did it, because you're still obligated in it. And that's my problem. The fact that you haven't yet fulfilled the mitzvah is considered my problem still.
Okay, now let's get to the colloquial aspect.
Yeah, so the colloquial aspect is that there's a general sense of responsibility from one Jew to another. There are a few ways that this demonstrates itself. You'll very often see people will say things like "Mi ka'amcha Yisrael" when Jews do something to reach out for other Jews who maybe they don't even know so well. A guy just came over to me at Mincha Marav this evening and said to me, "I got to tell you something about this neighborhood. How wonderful it is. I don't know when this episode is going to air, but right now, according to my computer, it is 18 degrees outside, and it feels like 1 degree outside. It is freezing." So this guy told me that the heat broke in his house last night. So his wife went on one of the neighborhood WhatsApp groups and said, our heat is broken. Does anyone have any space heaters? So by the time she hit send, she already had 40 responses.
Wow.
We have space heaters. He said that wasn't the impressive part. He said the impressive part was 4 separate people who they don't even really, they know, but they're not really that friendly with, reached out and said, they're saying that the fire that happened in the Bronx in that high-rise building was because of space heaters. I'll tell you what, just move in with my family for a couple of days till your heat gets fixed. We'll double up our kids in their rooms. You'll move in with my family. Who does that, right? You just bring in another family into your house. That's how we use it typically.
So it's funny because I think on a podcast very recently, I mentioned the story of a friend of mine who broke down on the Rockaway Turnpike, which is right near where you are. And he told me the story that he was there with a tow truck and a random guy that he doesn't know pulls up alongside, calls him off to the side, away from the tow truck driver, has a conversation with him, brings him back. The tow truck driver says, "What was that all about?" He said, "He just wanted to make sure you were treating me okay." He's like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah. Do you know that guy? Never met him before in my life." That's the type of situation.
Those kinds of stories. I mean, there are so many, and there's so many ways to demonstrate the truth of this concept in the way that it expresses itself, just in how we're trained and how we live our lives as Jews. The one I often like to tell, because I speak every now and then for an organization called Renewal. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
Renewal has been a guest on this show before.
Oh, okay. So one of the things that I always like to highlight is that of the altruistic kidney donors in the United States, which is an unusual thing to do, to just give a kidney to somebody that you don't know, 20% of them are Orthodox Jews. In the United States, now we make up a very, very, very tiny percentage of the American population. So you ask yourself, well, why is that? And I think the answer is simple, that it's the kind of thing you do for a family member. It's not the kind of thing you do for someone who's not a family member. It's just that we expand our definition of family. Right. Our definition of family is not just our brothers and sisters, in the nuclear family. Our definition of family is the entire Jewish people.
Okay, now before I go on, I do want to make a distinction because this is a question that I've had for a little bit, especially in researching this topic. Is it Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh or Bazeh?
So I think the way it's used in Chazal, I think they typically say Zeh Bazeh. I think that's usually the way.
I've been saying it wrong my entire life.
I don't know if it's wrong because you do find, if I'm not mistaken, you do find in Rishonim and Achronim that they use Zeh Lazeh. But I'm not even 100% certain about that.
Okay, so we spoke about the halachic and the colloquial. Now, is it possible that there is a halachic source for the colloquial, that there's a responsibility amongst each individual Jew to, I guess, be responsible for other Jews?
Well, I think the actual halachic source that we mentioned is a very legitimate halachic source for the idea of being responsible for other Jews. Meaning, if someone else's spiritual shortcoming is considered my spiritual shortcoming, one would imagine that someone's physical needs should be treated as my physical needs also. We do have the concept of chayecha kodmim, right? The Gemara says that if you're walking in a desert and you have only one cup of water and it's only enough to save one person, so v'chay achicha imach, the Torah says that your brother should live with you, but chayecha kodmim, your life comes before the other person's life. But implicit in that is that there's a struggle. Is that certainly if you have 2 cups of water, there's no doubt that you'd have to give it to someone else. It also relates a little bit to another concept. There's a concept called lo saman al dam reyacha, that if someone else is going through something, you're not allowed to stand idly by. If you have time, I actually have a pretty good story about that.
Go ahead, absolutely.
There's a wonderful guy that lives here in the Five Towns, Rob Kurtz, who I think he was a Hollywood writer at some point, and then he became a Baal Tshuva, I think, when he was in law school. And he spoke on a DRS Shabbaton many years ago, and the boys asked him, what did you see that made you want to become religious? And he said that when he was in law school, he had just taken a class where they had discussed the Good Samaritan law, that if you see someone in distress and you try your best to help them out, that they can't sue you for whatever. And he said that, what a bracha it is to live in such a moral, ethical society where they have laws like that. He said the next day he was in a class with, he was in Cardozo Law School, so he was in a class with Rabbi Bleich Shlita, Rabbi J. David Bleich, and Rabbi Bleich spoke about the halacha of lo saman al dam reyacha, that if you see someone in distress, according to Judaism, it's not only that you can't get sued or punished for trying to help, you are obligated to try to help. It is a prohibition in the Torah to just keep on driving and ignore them. And he said, what I thought yesterday was the highest morality was just dwarfed by a higher morality that I learned about today. And he said, so I just went over to Rabbi Bleich after the class and said, I needed to learn more. I need to hear more about this morality. So that's very much a Jewish value, that if someone else is in distress, whether you know them or not, it's irrelevant. We really believe that the Jewish people are brothers and sisters, and there's a Torah prohibition that you're not allowed to ignore it. They have to do something about it.
Okay, so I want to do something a little bit, I don't know. We'll see how this goes. Now, we spoke about the physical and the spiritual. I want to kind of combine those to see if there is something that is a requirement on our behalf. So we said that if somebody, let's say, still needs to be Yotzei Megillah reading or Kiddush or something along those lines, I have the obligation to make sure that they are Yotzei. So I myself can make that bracha, even though I did it already. We also spoke about the fact that it's my responsibility to make sure that everybody's physical needs are correct, depending on if you have a situation where it's freezing and you need some heat to stay warm, or your car is broken down on the side of the road. Is there a way to analyze it from a spiritual perspective that isn't necessarily a chiyuv that I initially act? I'll give you the example. The easy one is putting on tefillin. So I have a chiyuv to put on tefillin. Some other random person has a chiyuv to put on tefillin. Is it my responsibility to go after that person to get them to put on tefillin? Is it my responsibility to get other Jews to do mitzvos in the way that I think that they are supposed to be done? Or is there a line somewhere?
So there is a mitzvah in the Torah, that you're supposed to try to be mochiach people. Now, we often think of that as like this aggressive kind of mitzvah, that you should be that guy, that annoying person, that, anytime someone does something wrong, oh, you shouldn't say that, that's lashon hara, or something like that. But really, at its root, what it means is that you should try to help people become better. I think Rav Moshe Weinberger wrote an article in a halacha journal years ago, which is like a little surprising to people that, he wrote in a halacha journal, the Journal of Halacha in Contemporary Society. I think he wrote about kiruv and about the mitzvah of kiruv rechokim, and like why there's a mitzvah. Where do we find that there's a mitzvah of being makari of people, of bringing people closer to Yiddishkeit? And part of it, it's not all of it, part of it is socheach tochiach. Part of it is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, that if you genuinely love somebody else, like if you discovered an amazing restaurant that assuming kosher, that people don't know about, or you found some service that's online that will save people money, or something that people just don't know about. When you're excited about it, you want to tell everybody that you love about it, because it's such a bracha, it's such a great thing. You want to share that. If you genuinely love every Jew, and you really believe that we're onto something with the life of Torah and mitzvos, that we're onto something so precious that's worth sharing, you're just going to want to share it with everybody, and that's an obligation to do so.
So, but at what point does that line stop? At what point does my obligation end? How much pushback might I get from somebody else who isn't really that interested, until at the point where I said, all right, at that I'm done? Or does it not end, and do I have to keep pressing?
So a person has to use a good amount of seichel, always, a reasonable amount of common sense. When if you keep pressing, you're not doing kiruv at that point. You're doing richuk. You're pushing the person away. They're not interested anymore. So you have to know how to speak to people, how to genuinely love people. Generally speaking, I find that if people get the sense that you care about them, and you care about them in their entirety, and you're not judgmental of them, and you care about their physical needs and their spiritual needs and everything, and their emotional needs, generally speaking, such people will be responsive to you. It doesn't mean that every Jew is obligated to spend his whole day doing this, finding people who could use some work and working on them. But we all encounter a lot of people in our lives, and if each person that we encounter gets a sense that we care about them, that we love them, that we're kind to them, the opportunities will present themselves. Sometimes it involves getting a little bit out of our comfort zone, meaning I like spending Shabbos just with my family. I don't know, it's going to be weird if I invite this guy. Is he really interested? So sometimes you have to take that chance and ask a person, if you're ever interested, spend a Shabbos with our family. We'd love to have you. And you'd be surprised.
I'm going to ask you a little bit of a controversial question, and if you don't want to go this route, totally fine. What happens if, and I'm going to go back for this particular question, I'm going to go back to the physical. Okay. What happens if my definition of what I think is good for you physically does not meet your definition of what is good physically? And the reason that's controversial, because the easy area to look at this is COVID. So what I think might be good for you in terms of, let's say, vaccination, masking, and things like that, isn't what you think is good for you in vaccination and masking and all that. So at what point am I responsible to help you, and how do I navigate that kind of a murky situation?
So that is a bit of a controversial area, but it also is a very powerful lesson for that really reflects on exactly what we're talking about in terms of spiritual concern for others. Because what they found when dealing with people who are anti-vaccine, or are not interested in the vaccine, or who are, what they call in the medical community vaccine hesitant, let's say, what they found is that by yelling at them that they're a bunch of idiots and Neanderthals and anti-science doesn't work. It doesn't make them want to take the vaccine anymore. Well, what works? Some things, for some people, nothing will work to convince them. And at the end of the day, everyone's a bal b'chira. Everyone gets to choose what they do or don't do. But what they find, what actually works, is respecting a person, hearing them out, talking to them, educating in a non judgmental way, and that's it's an exact parallel. Of course, that's what works. We know that's what works because we're involved in talking to our brothers and sisters who maybe haven't been exposed to Torah and mitzvos as much as we have all the time. That's what we do. Of course, that's what works. That you don't judge a person, you don't lecture a person, you respect a person, you listen to a person, and you try to educate.
Now, it's funny because this could potentially work the other way, because if somebody thinks that a certain behavior is incorrect, so let's say the anti-vaxxer wants to convince you that you're doing the wrong thing, they could use that tactic as well, because the yelling kind of ends up going both ways.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, hopefully, the truth will carry the day.
Yes, and this isn't specifically just vaccines and COVID. This could be in terms of a diet, in terms of exercise, in terms of a lot of wearing your seatbelt while you're driving. It's any sort of health factor, or you could extrapolate that to any sort of mitzvah. It's any sort of thing that you kind of need to be able to balance that. So it's not necessarily, I just want to wrap this up in my head, it's not necessarily that somebody has the obligation incessantly to make sure, regardless of what means they use, whether it's, as you said, it should be with love, be'ahava, but it's not that you have an unlimited responsibility to do this. There are limits on it as far as Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh Bazeh goes, as far as any other sort of chesed related mitzvah goes. There are sort of limits, and as practicing Jews, we have to kind of assess those limits for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would frame it exactly that way, that there are limits. I think there's wisdom and there's counterproductivity, and a person has to be careful not to be counterproductive, and to do what we can. Again, a person doesn't have to be a meshugal davar echad. You don't have to make yourself crazy, constantly focusing on one thing in your life. A person has to be a balanced personality. And if you're running around trying to be Magayer, as many people as Avram Avinu did, you're unlikely to produce a Yitzchak Avinu in your own family. Meaning a person has to have a sense of balance in their lives also. But I wouldn't frame it that way, that there's a limit. There should be no limit to the amount of love we have for other people, but we have to be reasonable in the way that we express ourselves.
And I'm going to even apply this to something that maybe kind of needs this right now, and that is social media, where people kind of use social media to vent their frustrations and say things to people that they almost never would say in front of them face to face.
That is one of the many ills of social media.
Yeah. And I know I myself have been guilty of this in the past, where I talk to somebody on social media in a way that I would never speak to them the same way face to face, to the point where I've had some of these people on this show, and it's a much better conversation when you speak to a person instead of texting or typing at a person.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Sometimes if you find yourself getting into a text argument with someone, just call them.
Call them. Yeah, absolutely. And you can't express emotion on a text the same way you can in with your voice.
And I would say it differently. You sometimes express the emotion you express is not the emotion that's being received. So It's not that they're receiving zero emotion; they're receiving anger when you're expressing concern.
Correct. Or they're or it could be worse. Yeah, the other way around. Exactly. Before I ask you about, because there's one qualification that we didn't mention yet of yours, and that is your Daf Yomi Shir, which I happen to listen to. But before I asked you just two questions over there, is there anything else that you think is important that we should cover about this topic of Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh Bazeh?
I think it's just important to realize that we tend to be more sympathetic to people that we believe are like us, that we relate to, that have similar backgrounds to us. Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh Bazeh means no matter what kind of Jew the person is. The person could be a Yemenite Jew living in Israel who looks nothing like me, color of his skin and the haircut and the things that he's interested in, and he never heard of the Yankees before, and he, and that has to be the same love and the same concern. I may not be as equipped to connect to a person like that as I am with someone that I have common experiences with. If I was going to be a Rebbe in a school and try to be mashpia, I'd probably be much better off in a place like DRS where I taught than I would be in, I don't know, a Sephardi school in Harnof or something, or whatever, or a Russian immigrant school, because I have no shared experience with those people, right, with people from that background. But the level of love and the level of concern has to be there for every single Jew.
That is a phenomenal message. I do want to get just to indulge me with two things about the Daf Yomi Shir, and I've been bouncing around for different Daf Yomi Shirim. I've landed on yours, and it's phenomenal. It's very much the exact type of shir. If you're looking for a shir that will give you the Daf Yomi with a little bit of Mefarshim, a little bit of Rashi and Tosfos, in a nice 45-minute be'erach package, it's really a great listen, and a great way to follow. I do have one question that is not specific to your shir, but this is my third different shir that I've tried during Daf Yomi, but all of them have the same thing that I've noticed, and that is there's a lot more time given to Amud Aleph than Amud Beis. And I was wondering if you knew, like, the thought inside of me is, well, because I have all this information, I'm just giving it, and then once we get to the time limit that we've set, then we kind of rush to Amud Beis. But is there a way kind of to give Amud Beis a little bit of love moving forward?
Yeah. So there are two ways to do it. One way, which I haven't done either of them yet. One way to do it is my chavrusa, Rabbi Rosner Shlita, often says, next cycle I'm going to do Amud Beis and then Amud Aleph. Meaning, so that's one way to do it. Meaning not of that, meaning yesterday's Amud Beis and today's Amud Aleph, something like that. The other way to do it is to make a conscious effort in your mind not to say anything on Amud Aleph, just to read the Gemara. I've done that a few times because I knew that there was a lot of good Torah on Amud Beis sometimes, and I knew that I wouldn't get to it. So I would just say, you know what, I'm just gonna read the Gemara on Amud Aleph. But what I find is it's still at best, even if I'm making a conscious effort to do that, it's 50-50. It doesn't end up with Amud Aleph being 10 or 20% because I'm reading the Gemara at a normal pace because I still have time. There's something about that lachatz, that time pressure. Shachris is at 6:55 in my shul. I cannot finish at 6:56.
Yes, exactly.
If I look at my watch and it's 6:49 and I haven't turned the page yet, we got to get there one way or the other.
It's phenomenal. I do Daf on the train. My ride is exactly 43 minutes. So somebody actually turned me on to a different Daf Yomi share for anybody. I don't want to move anybody away from yours, but there's one called Lakewood Daf that he apparently, what he does is, and I forget what his name is. I apologize. I'm sorry?
It's Willie Bornstein.
Willie Bornstein, that's correct. And he is very exact. He plans out what he's going to talk about basically minute to minute. The problem that I had is that it's an hour. I don't have the hour. I need it to be 43 minutes.
Well, from what I understand is what he does now, I could be wrong about this, because I don't think I've listened to a full share of his, but from what I understand, he's very popular. He's excellent.
Yes.
People have come over to me and told me, I used to listen to you, but then I discovered this guy.
That's funny, really I moved the other way. He was the one
right. I mean, it's not a nice thing to say to me, but still, I get it. But from what I understand, he now does the daf in like 40 to 45 minutes, and then he'll spend the last 15 to 20 minutes on just straight raid.
Right. I guess that's another way to do it. You just do it straight and then go back and get. But I kind of like the way that it's interspersed, because for me it's very difficult to get out of what I was into and then back into what I did before. I'd rather do Chazara for me personally.
Right.
So I
don't know if you saw Yaakov Langer's video. He put out a video assessing the strengths and weaknesses of
he did. I have to go find that. Oh, that's amazing.
Top 11 Daf Yomi Shiurim or something.
That's phenomenal. You're gonna have to do that. The other thing, and I don't know if this was on purpose or not, but you inadvertently answered a question that was sort of raised by a tweet that I had that kind of went around, and that was about there's a college football player whose name is, I'm going to say it because you already answered the question, is Adonai Mitchell. And on one of your Daf Yomi Shiurim, I'm about a week and a half behind. So for me, at the time of recording, this was only like 2 days ago that I got up to it. And you answered that, if the person's name is the Shem Hashem, that's obviously not what he meant it to be. But even if it is what he meant it to be, then you can say his name. And when I posted
that, Shaila, but not from your tweet.
No,
I got that. There was a doctor that asked me, a fellow. Maybe are you a doctor?
I am not a doctor.
You're not a doctor. Okay, so there's a doctor that told me that there was a resident that he was overseeing who had such a name, and he didn't know what to do. So I asked Rav Shechter. Rav Shechter said, "Nah, it's just the person's name. It's okay."
That's what. So I when I posted it, a friend of mine who was at the time up to date, he's like, Rabbi Lebowitz just addressed this today on a shir. I'm like, was he addressing my particular tweet, or he's like, no, I think it just like inadvertently happened to coincide with this, and I thought it was kind of interesting. And after that, I tweeted that this was all part of my plan to get you to come on my show, and apparently it worked.
Yes. Okay. All you have to do is ask.
That's right. I appreciate it very much. Rabbi Lebowitz, while I have you on, where can people find your shir if they're interested in listening to it, or any other shirim that you have?
Oh, okay. My Daf Yomi shir and many other really great Daf Yomi shiurim, so I would encourage you to try them all, is on the All Daf app that's run by the OU, and also on the yutorah.org website. I have a lot of shiurim on the yutorah.org website, 10-minute halacha shir and longer halacha shiurim and Parsha drushes. I also do Parsha shiurim now. I post also on the All Parsha app from the OU, and Mishna Shiurim on the All Mishna app.
I will say that I listened to the Daf Yomi Shir on just a regular podcast app. I'm wondering, are all these? Did you know that your shiurim are available on regular like iTunes, SoundCloud stuff?
I didn't know that. I mean, I knew that the 10-minute halacha is because I get complaints sometimes that there are ads, and I have nothing to do with it. I'm not the one that puts it there. I'm not, So,
There are no ads on the Daf Yomi Shir app,
okay,
on the Daf Yomi Shir podcast. But I'm curious. I'm going to look up afterwards to see if any of these other shiurim are available on just regular podcasts, because I do enjoy the Daf Yomi Shir. I might as well add in another one.
Great.
And all right, Rabbi Lebowitz, thank you very much. This has been very enlightening, and I appreciate your time and your patience with me.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
My thanks to Rabbi Aryeh Lebowitz for joining me this week and helping us to understand the concept a little bit more clearly. I do feel like there is room for a follow-up episode on this topic, and if you'd like to hear more on it, please let us know on social media. Before I say goodbye for the week, I do want to mention one more side of covering this topic. For those of you who are regular listeners of Rabbi David Bashevkin's 1840 podcast, you'll know that he has opened up a hotline for listeners to call in and leave suggestions for topics. A few weeks ago, I called the hotline and left a suggestion for him to cover this exact issue, Kol Yisrael Areivim Zeh Bazeh. I figured that since this show is focused more on practical life, and this seemed to be more of a theoretical issue, I thought it would be better handled by someone else. But that idea lasted about 1 week, so I apologize to the 1840 podcast for immediately reneging on my claim that I would not be covering this topic at all. While you're all still here, I figured now would be a great time to ask you all for your help in making this show grow. Please rate this podcast on iTunes and leave a review. It certainly helps us reach more listeners. To all you out there, as always, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Israeli Picus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg. Follow us on Facebook at The Jewish Living Podcast and on Twitter and Instagram at Jewish_living. You can also email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.